Irish Heritage Festival Committee, which is a mouthful, for this year. And the committee members that are also, like, we're a great team. So if you are a committee member this year, they're probably wearing something that looks like this. And just stand up and identify yourself. So you're Elizabeth O'Dowd back there. Was the president for 7 years. It's meant to be a 1-year rotational thing. That presumes that somebody's going to step up and, you know, take the wand. And Michael O'Dowd is a fairly long-time member of the committee, and do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I've been a member a couple of years. I'm not very active, but I like to be involved with my namesake occasionally.
He's a sponsor.
I'm a sponsor as well.
Yeah. Which we really appreciate. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, I moved to Vermont 6 years ago. I was originally here for 14 years ago, traveling. Met my wife, and we lived in London and Dublin. They came back 6 years ago.
Yeah. Great.
Well.
Great. Elizabeth?
Elizabeth Hunt Schwartz, and I'm the vice president. I was one of the ones that never agreed to be president.
But we couldn't do without her as vice president, so I thought I better step in or we might lose her.
And Kathy?
Kathleen Thornton, Crosby Thornton, and with my husband, James.
I'm Jim. We're selling the lucky raffle ticket to
Very important job.
Right, but I'll definitely have my bear teacher persona once Fionnuala starts to talk. Nobody leaves the room.
That's pretty scary.
Unless you need, yeah, that's one way of putting it. Unless you need to use the restroom, and the key to the restroom is standing right behind Kathleen there, and it's that way. You go that way. You go into the mezzanine. You go down the stairs. You have to really want to use it. It's anyway. Peter, you want to?
Yeah, I'm Peter Keating. I'm kind of re-engaging in this committee. I was involved 15 years ago for 1 year, then pulled back. Decided it was time to get back involved.
And didn't you win the raffle ticket?
Well, yeah, I did.
I sold
Yeah,
the
there's a good
raffle
story
ticket.
there. A little bit more to the story. I took a CCD class to Ireland 10 years ago. When I came back, I gave a talk on that trip, and I bought a raffle ticket from Elizabeth, and it was a winning ticket.
He was getting the program for, so he deserved.
And Margaret? Oh, you're a member.
Yes, Margaret Harrington Fellows, and I've very happily done some Channel 17 work for the Burlington Irish Heritage Festival, where you can see a lot of the wonderful shows that they've done in the past, and some poetry shows. And I see Greg Delante here, the great poet from Burlington, and I've done such a few shows with him on William Butler Yeats. So that's how my tie-in is with Channel 17, and I'm glad Jordan is here to film this. Thanks.
All right.
And then Jim Shields is here.
And Lorraine.
Oh, there you are. Hi.
I'm Lorraine.
And I'm Jim Shields, Murray's dad. And we joined the committee this year because
I'm a freshman and I really want to be involved in Vermont Irish stuff.
And then we have a number of past either founders or people who have been on the committee before. Alice, stand up.
I'm Alice McNeish, former step dancing instructor, and have passed on the baton to Erlisa Garrett, who hosted a community Cali this past Sunday down in Richmond. So you're able to join us, great. If not, the next Cali is coming up on the 17th. I hope to see many people there and up on the floor dance.
And Jay McKee.
Hi everyone. I'm one of the founding board members, and who knew that 24 years later this would still be going on. Thank you all.
And Liam.
Sometime member of the group and self-appointed president of the Fenian Historical Societies.
thank you so much for coming. We were told just a little bit ago that we need to be out the door at 8 o'clock. So that means that we'll just have a very concentrated discussion. And a couple of things I want to say is, please, if your cell phone is on, do the airplane mode or just turn it off altogether. You're welcome to take pictures though, so maybe you don't want to turn it off altogether. I told you about the restroom key. The raffle tickets, we'll just have to see. Maybe, in a more casual, like question and answer period at the end, we'll open it up for raffle tickets again. And let's see, up at A, if you haven't signed up for email or you need a brochure, there's a sign-up sheet on the back there. And I'll say other things about the festival at the end, okay? So we are so privileged to have Fionnuala Quinlan here. She is the Irish Consul General, really based in Boston and for all of the New England states. Fionnuala I actually made my first contact with Shane Cahill, who was standing in while you were on maternity leave, right? And then, so it's great that our festival hadn't been connected really with anybody else in New England. And this year, the Consul General invited us all down for this great big conference in Canton at this great center that if you haven't been there, it's really worth it to go. And so now we're more connected, and everything, everything is better when we're connected. That's, we do good work. So, yes, so Fionnuala, I've just read about you, that you have a background in foreign aid. And why don't you talk about yourself? You probably will do a better job. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Ruth. And just to say thanks so much to all of you, first of all, for coming out this evening. It's brilliant to see so many people here. But also just thanks for your interest in Ireland. And I know from talking to you that so many of you are involved in, be it, dancing or other Irish culture, of course, very involved in the Burlington Irish Festival, which has been going for 24 years. That's just so heartening to say. And I was speaking to one of your, to Jay earlier, talking about when they founded it and just saying, I'm so touched when I come somewhere like this and I see how engaged people are with Ireland and how fond they are of Ireland. And that's just really, really heartening to see. So thank you on behalf of the Irish government for all you've done to really kind of keep Irish culture alive here and keep the bonds with Ireland so close. I know one of you I was talking to earlier is actually just getting on a plane next week and going over to volunteer in Ireland. So you're obviously just really, really connected, and that's wonderful. So as Ruth said, my name is Fionnuala Quinlan. I was appointed Consul General of Ireland to Boston in 2015. And although it's, we're based in Boston, obviously the Irish community is of course concentrated in and around Boston. We do cover the 5 states of New England with the exception of, or the one that we don't cover obviously is Connecticut, which is covered by New York. So my role is really to deepen and strengthen connections at all levels between Ireland and this part of New England. So that's, promoting Irish culture, trying to build deeper political relationships, trying to promote Irish business, supporting diaspora organisations. So that's, that conference that was held in Canton, for example, was outreach to Irish diaspora groups to say, well, how can the Irish government better serve you? Because as it happens at the moment, the government is actually writing a diaspora strategy for how we can engage better with Irish communities overseas. So I suppose those are kind of some of the big areas of my work. Before I came to Boston, I was the head of the press office in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the equivalent, of course, of your State Department. And I was recruited into the department about 10 years ago to run the press operation for Irish Aid, which is our overseas aid programme. And they had, for the first time, advertised for a media professional to do that work. So that's why I was able to apply for it, because my background is as a journalist, and I'd worked as a journalist and an editor for about 12 years before joining our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So that's been a very happy transition. It's brought me here to New England, which is just wonderful. And it's brought me here to Vermont tonight, so that's great.
One of the things that actually I have to just confess my ignorance of, I knew I wasn't hearing anything about violence in Northern Ireland, but I didn't know why, and it kind of coincided with me starting a family, having 4 kids, and I probably wasn't paying attention to the world out there. But it wasn't actually until I was following, I think it was something, Greg, of yours, a tweet that Dan Mulhall mentioned, and I looked up on this site, or I don't Twitter or tweet or whatever, and it was someone was interviewing Dan Mulhall about the Good Friday Agreement, and that it was the 20th anniversary, and then I started, like, what is this? And so I think this year would be coming up on the 21st anniversary, but clearly the Good Friday Agreement is the reason that we're not hearing about violence in Northern Ireland. And I was amazed how because I think I'm a pretty typical Irish American, and I think that we have, like, particularly if you grow up in a city with that identity, like a real strong sense of, fighting Irish and, years of oppression, even though, in fact, I haven't been oppressed, but, that sort of got the history. And then I know nothing about how peace came about. So I was just interested in if Fionnuala would talk a little bit about the Good Friday Agreement and how, like, obviously legislation happens, but then what is really happening in neighborhoods?
Okay.
How are people, does that mean that Catholics that hitherto, were pretty discriminated against in terms of getting jobs, are there jobs for them? Like, and then the whole business of Brexit and what might change.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the things that I kind of threw at her.
Okay, I should tell you that I was out at University of Vermont earlier with Kevin Thornton, who's here, and some of his students, and they asked me a similar question, and I spoke for an hour. So I'm definitely going to be trying to be more succinct. So a little bit of background to the Troubles. I mean, you're right when you say that peace has largely blossomed in Northern Ireland now. There are still some threats to peace, not least of which is Brexit. But basically, I guess if we're talking about the modern Troubles, we're talking about a period from the late 60s, 1960s, up to the late 90s when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. And I suppose if we go back to the 1960s, the Troubles basically arose from a sense of, I suppose you could say, disenfranchisement really by the Catholic community, a sense that that there was a lot of inequality, that Catholics who were also nationalists, meaning that obviously they wanted a united Ireland, were in a minority, whereas Protestants who were loyalists and who were in the majority commanded more resources in terms of housing, education and so forth. So actually, I suppose Catholics, led by John Hume and people of his ilk at that time, were very much inspired by the American civil rights movement, actually, and they started to demonstrate looking for our better rights. And then that became, I suppose, violent, with the result that the British Army sent in troops, and the IRA kind of became, I suppose, stronger. Actually, the Provisional IRA, which is the IRA that we now know, grew out of an IRA that had been there for quite a while. But in short, there were quite a few paramilitary groups that were set up. So the IRA on the nationalist side, the Ulster Defence Association, the Ulster Volunteer Force, and others on the Protestant loyalist side. And really, I suppose Northern Ireland just descended into a cycle of really terrible, terrible violence. So the figures are pretty stark. Almost 4,000 people lost their lives. Coming up on about 50,000 people were injured. There's about 36,000 shootings. So, I mean, if you think about those, obviously 4,000 people killed, the impact on their families, but also of people injured. And if you extrapolate those figures out to a US context, I mean, Northern Ireland, you have to remember, is an extremely small place. It has a population of 1.5 million. So if we were to place the context in America, you would be talking about 800,000 people dead and probably about 6.5 million political prisoners. So that gives you a sense of the scale of the conflict, actually. But this cycle of violence went on, and of course, you know, people tried very hard, you know, to bridge that cross-community gap. And I guess it was, you know, there'd been numerous efforts to bring peace to Northern Ireland. But finally, I think probably in the early 90s is when the big push that led to the Good Friday Agreement happened. And there was a political process that was started involving the British and Irish governments and the political parties that were involved the political parties that were in Northern Ireland, some of whom, for example, the IRA would have been regarded as being very much allied to Sinn Féin. So Sinn Féin was involved in those talks eventually, and some of the unionist parties also became involved. So we ended up with inter-party talks with both governments involved under the leadership of Senator George Mitchell. And I should pay tribute here to the involvement of the US, which was really, really critical throughout this whole process. People like Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill, Senator Ted Kennedy. You can think of, I mean, Senator George Mitchell actually led that peace, you know, was the US envoy and really led that peace process as an objective and an independent person. Of course, your own Senator Patrick Leahy here. Senator Leahy has been, you know, a real good friend of Ireland. Richie Neal in Massachusetts now as well. So the American involvement can't really be understated, I think. But in short, I mean, it was a tortuous process, but that's really what led to the Good Friday Agreement. And what the Good Friday Agreement did was it recognized that there were essentially three sets of relationships. So there was the relationship between the two communities three sets of relationships that were broken. There was the relationships between the two communities in the north, the nationalist and the unionist communities that needed a huge amount of work. There was a relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and there was the East-West relationship between Ireland and the UK. So the Good Friday Agreement took each of those three sets of relationships and put structures in place basically to make them work better. So within the north, that led to the setting up of a devolved government. So basically power came back from London to Belfast, and parties from both sides of the divide were involved in running government. There were structures put in place so that our north and south could work better together. So, I mean, now there are structures, for example, in healthcare and shared tourism and things that you would expect on an island, basically, that it would work more cohesively together. And then, of course, both states, so the government, the British and Irish government, were what are called co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement. So they both have a very strong stake in ensuring that the Good Friday Agreement remains in place. So that was signed 21 years ago. There was votes held on both sides of the border. The people voted basically, and it was passed by an overwhelming majority. But as George Mitchell said, if you think getting the agreement is hard, implementing it is going to be even harder. So, and that certainly has proven true. So there's been a series of political processes since then, but certainly, you know, the Good Friday Agreement also led, for example, to the decommissioning of weapons, following ceasefires by the paramilitary organisations. So the big job of work, I think, that remains outstanding is that of reconciliation, and the legacy of the past, the legacy of the hurt, the legacy of sectarianism, and that is a job that I think people recognise is going to take generations. So to come up to the present day, there's been a breakdown actually of the political process in Northern Ireland. So that government that I spoke about earlier, the government that drew parties from politicians from both sides of the community, that actually has been in suspension for 2 years, and that's particularly alarming now, I think, in light of Brexit, which obviously is going to have such a big impact on Northern Ireland, but they don't have a voice, a solid governmental voice in Northern Ireland advocating for them. Of course, I mean, the British government is the Secretary of State there, and the Irish government is advocating on behalf of the peace process and so forth. But in an ideal world, you'd also have that government there. The reason Brexit poses a threat is, so if the UK is to leave, the Northern Irish border will be the UK's only land border with the European Union. But this isn't just any border. This is a border that was the most militarized in Western Europe for 30 years. You know, you're talking about, you know, huge British Army presence, watchtowers, you know, it was a major military border effectively. And after the Good Friday Agreement, that all came down. So now, instead of driving up to the border and, you know, being greeted by, you know, soldiers with guns and a whole security apparatus, you zip across the border and you don't even know you're in a different country until you notice that actually the road markings are different, or, you know. So that's been a huge dividend, actually. That's been a huge dividend of the peace, I think, that people can go back and forth freely. You know, they're going across to shop, they're going across to visit families. There's farms that actually are on either side of the border. There's more border crossings between Ireland, the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland than there are between the US and Canada. There's 300. And thousands upon thousands of vehicles go across there every year. So I suppose Ireland's big concern is if a border goes up, of course, initially it would just be an administrative border, right? It'd be customs posts. But the first shots of the Troubles were fired at customs posts. So the big fear that I think, you know, the Police Service of Northern Ireland, the Gardaí and others have is if you put customs infrastructure there, that becomes a target for dissidents. Because I should say as well, while the vast majority of paramilitary organisations have laid down their arms and decommissioned their arms, there do remain dissident forces who don't really wish to see peace. And in fact, within the last, I think, 6 weeks, there was a car bomb in Derry. You know, there are still ongoing attacks on the Police Service of Northern Ireland. So it's not as though everything is perfect, you know. So the danger does remain there, and I suppose there's a big danger of complacency. So the concern is obviously if you've customs posts and they are attacked, then, you know, you end up having police to protect the customs infrastructure and customs personnel, and then they get attacked, and then, you know, the danger is that you end up back to a border that is fortified. But it's also psychological. So, you know, people are used now to having, the Good Friday Agreement also allowed citizens of Northern Ireland to be British or Irish or both. And then you also had this other identity, which was a shared identity, and that was European. So I think for those reasons as well, you know, Britain leaving the EU will potentially have a huge impact on Northern Ireland and on the Republic of Ireland. I mean, we're the most exposed economically and because of the peace process and so forth. So where we're at the moment is the EU and the UK negotiated a withdrawal agreement over almost 2 years. It's a legal treaty, runs to almost 600 pages. As you can imagine, you know, this is the first time anybody has withdrawn from the EU. So I suppose that to a degree it was kind of uncharted waters. Now there was a mechanism for it, but I'm not sure that people, you know, really expected, you know, as I was saying earlier to the students, you know, so many countries wish to, you know, join the EU that I don't know that people really expected, you know, countries to want to opt out of the EU. So, and Britain, of course, has been a really important member of the EU, you know, and for Ireland, you know, we had a lot of shared interests, so it's a big loss to us, Britain leaving the EU. So, but where we're at the moment is this: we have this withdrawal agreement. What the withdrawal agreement has a protocol on Northern Ireland, which, you know, the Irish government really negotiated very hard to get in there, which basically says that unless and until some other mechanism can be found to avoid a hard border, that the UK will remain in regulatory alignment with the EU. So it'll mean they'll have some of the same standards and so forth, so that goods will continue to be traded freely, basically. So it means we don't have to implement a hard border on Ireland. So that is what the protocol says. And it was agreed between the UK and the EU, but the Prime Minister failed to get agreement of her Parliament on that. In fact, they rejected it by by over 200 votes. So the negotiations have been back and forth to Brussels now, trying to find a solution to this very vexed issue. And the deadline for the UK to leave the EU is the 29th of March. So, you know, that's really looming very soon now. And there's been a lot of votes, and there's been a lot happening in Westminster. One of the most recent is Theresa May has said she's going to come back and put a deal before her Parliament again on the 12th of March. If that's not accepted, there is now a mechanism whereby Parliament can vote to delay Britain's exit from the EU. We don't know exactly. I mean, Britain will have to ask, obviously, ask the EU to allow that delay. The EU has signalled that it's open to doing so. We don't know how long that'll be, but basically I expect, I mean, what it'll essentially do is give some breathing space for those negotiations to continue, so that the UK doesn't leave suddenly with all of the, you know, devastating impacts that would have on the British economy, on, you know, the Irish economy, and on other economies. So a managed exit whereby, you know, there's time for alternative arrangements to be put in place is really, I suppose, it seems like a likely outcome at this stage. But, you know, there's been a lot of twists and turns on this road, and anybody who tells you they know exactly what's going to happen, you know, really doesn't, because, you know, there's been, as I said, there's been a lot of twists and turns. So I hope that wasn't too long-winded. It's been a pretty complex process, you know, but that's where the Irish government's priorities certainly lie, I think, particularly around protecting the peace process.
Thank you very much. I have one question and then I'll open it up. So much of the tension, so much of the lack of civil rights was also economic, right? So that the Catholics living in Northern Ireland just weren't getting the jobs. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, certainly there was a real sense of that, yeah.
So then you have a peace process, but a peace process won't work if life doesn't get better, day-to-day life doesn't get better for people. So was that part of the whole process, and did that certainly the Celtic Tiger, well, that was before, but Ireland's resurgence as a healthy economy. But so did life get better for Catholics in Northern Ireland under the Good Friday Agreement? I guess that's...
Well, I suppose what the Good Friday Agreement did is it put in place a government that represented both communities. So, you had a democracy that was representative of both communities. So therefore, I suppose they had much more of a stake in the power structure. So yeah, I think that certainly has led to greater equality in Northern Ireland. Yeah, which you're right. I mean, a lot of, economically, I mean, Northern Ireland, I think, was in the key years of the Troubles, was also quite an economically deprived part of the UK. And of course, that did contribute to some of the issues that we saw there.
Thank you. So, yes.
Could you speak a little more about the suspension of the government 2 years ago, how it came about, and how it's working without any functional government, British rule, the changeover? I don't understand that.
And let me just interrupt for a sec. Did everybody hear that? Would you stand up and project that question? If I try to repeat it with my loud voice, I won't.
If she could talk about the suspension of the Northern Ireland government 2 years ago, how it came about, what impact it's had. It seems to be a country without a government or under different British overarching rule. I don't understand how it works. It doesn't work. Explain that.
Sure.
So the government, as I mentioned, was made up of parties from either side of the community. And they were involved in a power sharing agreement. And what actually led to the collapse of it was a controversy about a scheme called, what was it called again? RHI, I think it was. But essentially it was a controversy about a scheme that involved heating homes. But there was some allegations that some of the parties on one side hadn't acted in a completely straight manner about this. So that was actually the trigger that brought down the government at the time. And there had been government prior to that for about 10 years. But what happened in Northern Ireland actually is two of the parties that were initially involved in the power sharing agreement was the SDLP, which was the party that had been led by John Hume, who was really, a central figure in bringing in the political process that led to the Good Friday Agreement, and the Ulster Unionist Party. And both of those were more moderate parties, really. But over time, the moderate parties have gotten more sidelined in Northern Ireland, actually. So the two parties that were in power at the time that the power-sharing government collapsed were the Democratic Ulster, the Democratic Ulster Party, the DUP, and Sinn Féin. And I guess, you know, relations probably had deteriorated, certainly had deteriorated, to the extent that a controversy like the one that happened could trigger the government to fall. And although it's been 2 years now and there's been a huge amount of work by the British and Irish governments working with the parties on the ground to try to get the institutions back up and running and to have government in Northern Ireland again, that hasn't happened. So my understanding is that the ministries, so the civil servants are still working. You know, so the different ministries are still functioning, but without the political leadership, essentially. And you have, of course, the British government appoints a Secretary of State, who's Karen Bradley. So the British, you know, they still have, obviously, input, but they haven't come in and instituted direct rule on things, because I think they're trying to allow space for a political process to happen again. And there's talks constantly ongoing, like our Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney, he's also our Deputy Prime Minister, is really involved in that process, and he's in Northern Ireland a lot, talking to the political parties a lot, and really trying to get that process back up and running again. But it's been 2 years, so, you know, it's time.
Yes, the people of Northern Ireland voted against Brexit.
Yes.
And there have been calls among other peoples of the UK, such as the Scots, who voted against Brexit for a second referendum. Are there such voices in Northern Ireland, and where are they coming from? And does the government of the Republic have a view on this, or are they kind of hands-off?
Thanks for your question. So the government hasn't taken a position on a second referendum. I mean, of course, you know, we have to respect the decision of the peoples of the UK to vote, even if we wish it were otherwise. I can't think off the top of my head of a particular, of a party in Northern Ireland that has advocated strongly for a second referendum. I think a lot of the voices we've heard are coming from, you know, maybe more from within England and Scotland and so forth, but I could be mistaken on that. I'm just not familiar with a particularly loud call for that within Northern Ireland. So that was those were two aspects of your question. Is there a third that I missed? No, that was it. Okay.
Excuse me. What are the chances of, in the 29th of March, of the stalemate sort of falling through and bringing about a referendum, a second referendum, do you think? Is there a possibility, real possibility?
Like I said to you, you know, I really don't know. I mean, the Labour Party has now, the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn has indicated that they would be open to a second referendum. I'm not sure the parliamentary arithmetic in Westminster would necessarily support that at the moment, but at the moment there seems to be more of a move towards having a breathing space, so delaying Brexit. And actually the Prime Minister agreed that a vote will happen on that if on the 12th of March the deal that was agreed with the EU is rejected. So that seems to be the next step. There's nothing concrete, there's no concrete vote or anything on a second referendum, but hard to...
What are the chances in the 29th or the 12th of the EU turning down, saying you've got to leave if you said you're leaving and we're not giving extra time?
The EU has indicated, no, I mean they've indicated, because it's not a hard Brexit isn't in anybody's interest, you know, like that's it, it'll damage the EU, it'll damage Britain, it'll damage Ireland without a doubt. So no, the EU has said, you know, a request has to come from the UK, of course, but that they would be open to it. Yeah.
Is this a way out in the end, ultimately, if it's extended so far out, that it's a way of getting a second referendum?
Well, Theresa May has, when she speaks, she's spoken of a short delay. You know, I mean, there's the issue of the European elections that are going to take place in the summer. So normally, you know, because Britain was due to leave on the 29th of March, they wouldn't be participating in those elections. So that's an issue. Like, what happens if it goes beyond May or June? Will Britain participate in those elections? But of course, the term is 5 years. So there's, you know, it is kind of a complicated issue. That's for sure.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. What effect would Brexit have on the effort to get the government back together
In Northern Ireland?
Would it make it worse or better, or?
I was trying to think what the likely impact of that would be.
Could you ask the question again?
What impact would Brexit, you know, either passing it or delaying it or whatever? You were talking about the government in Ireland being in a sort of an open space.
Government in Northern Ireland.
Northern Ireland,
Ireland, yeah.
Northern
Yeah.
Ireland. In being sort of not structured at the moment. It's been 2 years. They're working on coming up with some arrangement. But if all of a sudden Brexit comes, and what impact would it have on those efforts to get the government better organized?
Well, I mean, both the British and Irish governments remain co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, which essentially means they both have a stake in ensuring that the Good Friday Agreement is honoured. And the Good Friday Agreement removed the border. The Good Friday Agreement set the standards, set up the institutions basically that are now, in abeyance, I suppose. The Good Friday Agreement will remain in place. It's an international treaty. So both Ireland and both the Irish and British governments, really irrespective of the outcome of Brexit, will still have to honour the commitments of the Good Friday Agreement.
But do you think if there's a hard border, that might change expectations?
Well, the Good Friday Agreement means that there isn't a hard border. So I suppose all of our efforts are on securing the fact that there won't be a hard border. So currently, the plan is that the UK will remain in regulatory alignment, so there won't be a border. Now, I suppose your question is if the UK suddenly crashes out of the EU, what happens on the border? Is that partly your question as well? So currently what's due to happen is the UK is due to leave on the 29th of March, but not too much changes until December 2020. There's this interim period that was set in place to allow businesses and others basically to prepare for it. Now, if Britain crashes out, then that interregnum isn't in place. So I suppose the government isn't preparing for a hard border. There's no secret plan. We're not, getting ready to put infrastructure in place on the border. Having said that, obviously, Ireland is part of the EU. We're part of the single market, and we'd have responsibilities as a result of that. Because, of course, we have to protect the single market and the flow of goods within that space, and the UK would no longer be part of that. But the UK also would have to observe World Trade Organization rules, so they'd have their own responsibilities as vis-a-vis trade between the two jurisdictions. But the overarching kind of issue here is for both governments, I think, and the Prime Minister of Britain has also been very clear in that, she doesn't want to see a hard border. She's very committed to the peace process. Obviously, it was very hard won. So I think both governments are really taking their responsibilities under the Good Friday Agreement really, really, really seriously. So, hi.
Hi. So how will the Brexit? How do you think Brexit will affect the trade relations between Ireland and regular Ireland and the UK?
Regular Ireland. I know what you mean. So Ireland is going to be the most impacted country in the EU by Britain's departure, without a shadow of a doubt, because they've been on a whole range of issues. But I mean, if you take the most basic one, which is, a good percentage of our exports go to the UK. Now, not nearly as much as would have gone before we joined the EU. I think it was something of the order now of about maybe a quarter of our exports go to the UK, whereas before it would have been, way up over the 50% mark. But certain industries are particularly going to be impacted. And those are like agriculture, because if you can imagine, if you're selling mushrooms or carrots or whatever, chances are you're not selling them to China. You're selling them somewhere very close by, so you're selling them across the border or you're selling them to the UK. So that's a big concern. Fisheries, agriculture, there's, construction again, because, you're not, you're sending construction supplies like right next door or whatever. And the economy of Northern Ireland would be really badly impacted by it, because they send a very big percentage of their goods across the border into Southern Ireland, And in some cases, things go back and cross the border many times on a production chain, So something's produced in Northern Ireland, and then there's added value in the Republic, and then it goes back across to be sold. And so, there's a whole suite of issues there that would definitely impact us. Having said that, Ireland will remain part of the single market, which is a market of, well, it's 500 million at the moment. Obviously, without Britain, it would be 435 or thereabouts, 435 million. The government's put a huge amount of work into preparing for Brexit and preparing for a hard Brexit, even though obviously we don't want it, we have to prepare for it. So like just at the moment there's a what they call the Brexit omnibus bill going through the Irish Parliament, and that's a huge suite of legislation that'll put in place measures to protect the economy and jobs and so forth in the event of a hard Brexit. But the other thing, I suppose, when we talk about how Britain leaving will affect Ireland is, within the EU, Britain's been a very close ally of ours, and actually, that EU membership was very important to the peace process as well, because, Britain and Ireland suddenly came together at these ministers and government members came together very, very regularly around EU meeting tables. And there was a kind of a neutral, shared space for them to meet and to have shared interests and realise, that of course we have so much in common, and that, in terms of outlook, being very open and export-oriented economies, we'd a lot in common. So, that's also a loss, I think, to Ireland, that we lose a very like-minded ally within the European Union.
Were they meeting in Brussels or at the Parliament, or in these meetings?
At the EU, they would have been meeting in Brussels largely. Yeah. But I mean, Ireland, the British and Irish government have put in place, a series of regular meetings. So there is, there's a forum now for the British and Irish ministers to meet very regularly and discuss. The Taoiseach and the Prime Minister meet very regularly. There's more Irish people living in Britain than there are in the west of Ireland. The economies have been so close, and people have been, people of Ireland and England have been so close. Like, we have since the 1920s what's called a common travel area, that actually, again, has been protected as part of the Brexit negotiations. But since the 1920s, the British and Irish governments have had an agreement whereby our citizens can kind of move seamlessly between each other's countries. So you can go and live and work in Britain, you can, get services from the NHS and so forth, and British people can come to Ireland and do the same. So, those relationships have been built up over many decades. And what Ireland wants and what the EU wants is the closest possible relationship with Britain after it exits the EU. That's definitely what everybody has said, is we want the closest possible, the deepest relationship that we can have.
So you break up, but you remain friends.
Exactly.
And that works so well.
Yeah.
Hi. You spoke about reconciliation and how difficult that is and how it takes generations. And we know that based on the world and these kinds of disputes, waiting for it magically to happen over generations hasn't really worked. And I've been following very closely Canada's reconciliation process with the Indigenous people and the residential schools. We've just had our very first reconciliation process in the States in Maine around the Samoa issue. I'm sort of wondering what Ireland in many ways is a pioneer in some of the more formal reconciliation processes. I know we've learned a lot from South Africa and Rwanda. What measures, sort of conscious, intentional structures or measures looking out over generations is Northern Ireland taking?
Yeah.
Are they?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, that's a big piece of work. And there were numerous further political processes to deal with some of those issues as they came up. So there's a couple of agreements that happened after the Good Friday Agreement that aren't nearly as well known. There was the St. Andrews Agreement, I think that was in 2007. There was a Stormont House Agreement that was in 2014. And that was the agreement that really looked at legacy and put in place mechanisms whereby, you know, victims could seek truth and reconciliation and justice, that there could be inquests and so forth. So there was a whole suite of measures that were put in place. Now, progress in implementing them has been somewhat patchy, and of course, you know, the current stalemate in Northern Ireland doesn't help that. But a lot of the really good work is happening in communities. And, you know, there's a lot of really excellent community organisations working in Northern Ireland that are working across the divide and that are really bringing, you know, people from both sides together. And the Irish government, you know, funds a lot of that work because we recognise how important it is. And actually our foreign minister just recently announced an increase in the budget for that. So, and I was telling, I think, the students today that I talked to last week at the consulate, we had a really interesting man come speak to us. His name is Reverend Gary Mason, and he was been a Methodist minister in Northern Ireland for 30 years. But he was really, really involved in bringing the paramilitary organisations into the peace process. But he was excellent at reaching out across the divide, and like he formed relationships with Sinn Féin and maintained those relationships over 30 years. And he spoke, you know, he spoke very funnily really last week about, you know, that and how, like, obviously the first time he went to meet them, you know, it wasn't easy. These were really tough conversations. These were really difficult conversations, but you just had to keep plugging away at it in good faith and with honesty and with trust and with trying to see, you know, really trying to look at the situation from the other's side, you know. And he made the point, I think, quite convincingly that, you know, we spoke about all the political prisoners there were and the fact that there would be almost 6.5 million if were it here in the US. But, you know, he was just making the point that if those people had grown up anywhere else, if they'd grown up in Burlington, most of them would probably have led very normal lives. You know, they wouldn't have gotten involved in criminal activity. They wouldn't have ended up in prison. And he started his conversation actually with a really arresting story of 3 little boys who went to school together. And one of them ended up shot. One of them ended up slitting somebody's throat and throwing them into a dumpster, basically. And one of them was him. And, you know, he was asked afterwards, how come you didn't go down the path of violence? And he had quite a funny answer to that, actually. But anyway, he just made the point that his answer was lust. That, you know, he thought going into this, you know, like it was going to be a very hard life that didn't offer very many opportunities. And he was a 17-year-old young man who thought, no, he'd a date that night, and, you know, fate took him another way. But you know, he just spoke so well about that. And one of the things he said that's really stayed with me since is he does work now. So he has this organisation called Rethinking Conflict. So he uses the lessons learned from the Northern Ireland peace process to work with the Palestinians and the Israelis in the Middle East, to work with communities in the South around racism. Because again, you know, some of the issues, it's about, you know, seeing the other and you know, having empathy and all of those things, compassion. And but he talked about they bring Israelis and Palestinians over to Northern Ireland regularly. I mean, I think he said they'd have 600 or 700 over in the last couple of years, and they, you know, they introduce them to former combatants, and they get them talking to people who've now, you know, people who've come together from both sides in Northern Ireland. And the question being, well, you know, how do you manage to look your enemy in the eye and realize that at some point you're going to have to come to some kind of a resolution because neither side is going anywhere, you know. But he talked about having brought a rabbi to Northern Ireland, and, you know, with all the history of that the Jews have suffered, the Holocaust and so forth, he said he was just really surprised to hear that rabbi say that he could feel the hurt in Belfast, that he felt like almost it was in the air or whatever. And Gary said he was just really taken by that because, you know, you would think that maybe, you know, in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv or in other places that there would be, you know, there'd be as much, but no, this rabbi said no, in Belfast he could really feel it. So there's a huge job of work to be done on that reconciliation piece.
I'm just going to mention that an important part of the long-term reconciliation is having children from different communities go to schools together.
Yeah.
Because that, all this, it's learned.
Yeah.
And when they, at a very young age, and they're integrated, and then some wonderful things happen, and people see each other as people.
Yeah.
And I think that in many parts of the world, that's been an important aspect.
Yeah, that's very true. And there's a lot of scope for that to happen more in Northern Ireland. There's been a lot of work done on that, on trying to desegregate schools, but certainly more to be done.
Got a ways to go, yes.
Yeah. Hi, how are you? Sorry.
Interesting things that just happened. I don't expect you to be spot on all the current events, but there were some bombs that were discovered in London just yesterday.
Yeah.
And they said they tied them back to Ireland.
Yeah.
And what's the end game? I mean, I know there's a lot of crazies, right? But, putting bombs at the airport at Heathrow, right? What would be, what card are they playing? Are they saying that they want them to rethink Brexit? They claim on the news, but it was limited last night, that it was Brexit related. So I'm not sure if you had the time to read the paper today about it. And I just don't understand, where the end game is for something like that.
Yeah. I'll be honest with you, I saw this morning that the police in Britain were saying they don't know the motivation of it. So for those of you who don't know, there was 3 jiffy bags delivered to 2 airports in London and to Waterloo Station, one of the train stations in London, and they contained improvised explosive devices, so that when they were opened, they would start a small fire basically. And I understand one of them indeed did lead to a fire, and the others were caught pretty quickly. So they had Dublin postmarks on them, but I know that the British police were saying today that they didn't really know the motivation for them. They haven't identified who sent them. So obviously, I really don't know. I don't know. And I mean, until we know, I suppose, where they came from, it'd be hard to speculate as to the motivation behind them. Yes, sir.
Evidently, some of the motivation for Brexit in Britain is the immigration policy in the EU. Is there any concern in the Republic about how your relationship would change because of the immigration? Would that be another argument for having a firmer border? In other words, if Britain doesn't want immigrants coming through Ireland as a portal?
Sure. You're right. Immigration was one of the key factors in Brexit. I think that the fact that there's free movement of people within the EU. I think some people in Britain came to resent that, and the idea was take back control of our borders, take back control of the ability to negotiate trade agreements and so forth. I don't know if the British government would see the importance of a hard border related to immigration necessarily, because as I said to you, certainly at the moment we have this common travel area that means Irish people can come and go in Britain, but I suppose what you're referring to is maybe that some other European Union citizens would come through Ireland and go to Britain.
Well, isn't there some agreement within, or supposed to be within the EU, that each country is supposed to take a certain number of immigrants?
Take a certain number of refugees. Yeah, refugees so not immigrants from within the EU system, because I suppose they're all EU citizens and therefore can travel freely. But so the EU has a policy of, you probably know obviously there was a big refugee crisis that largely affected Italy, Spain, and Italy, Greece, and the Mediterranean countries. Obviously, Ireland was somewhat shielded from that just by our geographic location, as were some other EU countries. So the EU came up with a scheme whereby each country was allotted or signed up for a number of refugees, largely from kind of Middle East, North African region, that route at least they were coming through. And Ireland signed up to take actually more than was requested of us. Obviously, if Britain is no longer in the EU, they wouldn't be party to that. But the numbers are small, I can't think off the top of my head exactly what Ireland's number are now, but they're in the kind of low thousands. So I don't know that particular programme would be a huge factor, but I suppose, the EU, the concept of the EU is free movement of goods, people, capital and services. So the British, if they're not part of that anymore, obviously the goods won't be moving freely because, there'll be a whole raft of administrative customs procedures and so forth. And obviously movement of people will also be curtailed. So how exactly that happens is at the crux of the issue that minds are grappling with in the UK and in Brussels as we speak, I've no doubt. Hi.
Are there a lot of requests for citizenship from the British to Ireland, to Republic of Ireland?
Yeah, so one of the things the Good Friday allowed was that citizens of Northern Ireland could be British or Irish or both. And of course, so many Irish people moved to Britain. So the Irish government, or the Irish state rather, allows you to become an Irish citizen if you have a grandparent born on the island of Ireland. So we've had a huge spike in applications from the UK for people getting an Irish passport. And obviously some of that, we assume is so that they can continue to, benefit from those EU agreements. And of course they're entitled to it. They wouldn't get it if they weren't. So, but also in Northern Ireland, I think, there's been stories of, kind of some ardent unionists who have applied for a passport because they're being kind of, they're taking a very practical approach to like, why wouldn't they when they have the option? Yeah. So certainly, that's something that we've seen.
Would you expect that would change if Brexit, if there was a hard Brexit, that they would stop that dual citizenship with the Irish?
No. That's very established. It's been practiced for a long time, and that's all around the world. It's not just in Britain, I mean, the Northern Ireland thing, the fact you can be British, Irish, or both is obviously Northern Ireland, but if you have a grandparent born on the island of Ireland, you're entitled to Irish citizenship, and that's been long-standing practice. Oh, good. Very good, very good. Anybody else have a question? Or?
Hi. With London being the great financial center that it is, I'm just wondering, presently, what is or what should be the American government's role as far as encouraging them to, or maybe it's beyond their control, whether they can stay in the EU or being a mediator in this whole situation, and going back to the time of George Mitchell, Tim O'Neill, President Clinton, and those kind of. But is there an American role, and should there be one?
I mean, I suppose, whether we like it or not, the British people voted to leave the EU. 52% of them voted to leave the EU. So that's a democratic decision by sovereign people. So, but I know President Obama did speak in favor of Britain remaining in the EU and urged people, I think, to think about the values that the EU brought. But certainly, we are seeing that some financial institutions, because London obviously is a huge financial centre, but because they're in the EU, they benefit from what are called passporting rights. So that's the ability, as we said, freedoms to move capital around. Obviously, they won't have those freedoms anymore after they exit the EU. So we are seeing some of the big banks and other financial institutions start to look at where else they can. Dublin as well, Dublin, Amsterdam, Paris, Frankfurt, yeah. They're some of the main centres that people are looking for. And that is one potential upside I should mention amongst all the downsides, is when Britain leaves the EU, Ireland will become the only English-speaking common law jurisdiction within the EU. So we can expect that some of those companies that continue to look to set up a European headquarters, Ireland's very attractive for a whole raft of reasons, but now, I suppose the fact that, so there may be some upsides from that. I mean, not that they'll counterbalance the downsides, but maybe a little silver lining. Huh?
Copper linings.
Yeah.
Can we look forward to you being the Taoiseach one of these days?
Being the Taoiseach. Our Taoiseach actually is, he's on his way to the US now. He'll be here early next week. No. I'd say I'd agree with you, certainly. Yeah, I'd agree with you. Sometime when our current Taoiseach is, he's relatively new, he's hugely popular. Do many of you know about our current Taoiseach? He's called Leo Varadkar. He's quite young, I think he's probably around 40, thereabouts. His mom is Irish, his dad is Indian, so he's of, mixed heritage. He announced maybe about 5 years ago that he was gay, and he has a partner who travels with him, and so he's certainly kind of a face of a new progressive Ireland. He's hugely popular in Ireland, so I don't suppose he'll be going anywhere at any time soon. But yeah, we've had some Irish presidents. We've had a number of great Irish presidents, Mary Robinson, of course, and Mary McAleese. So and we've had Irish deputy prime ministers, but we've yet to have an Irish prime minister.
What about some of the old names, like the Jerry Adams and the Ian Paisleys? Are they quiet now? Are they old? Are they...
Ian's very quiet.
So Ian Paisley Sr. passed away actually a number of years ago. Jerry Adams has stepped down as president of Sinn Féin. He's been replaced by Mary Lou MacDonald, but he still remains a member of Parliament in Ireland. So he represents Louth, which is one of the border counties. So obviously, he's not as prominent as he was before because, he's no longer president of the organisation, but he's still a Teachtadála, a TD, a member of the Irish Parliament.
Actually, there's a very good movie. Now, I don't know how true it is. It's probably involved with the Good Friday Agreement, but it might have been where Ian Paisley, and McGuinness. You should try and check it out. I don't know how true it is. Have you seen it at all?
I don't.
It's excellent.
What's the name of it?
Shackle Brothers. Huh?
Shackle Brothers?
Yeah.
Is it about their relationship?
Well, they're driving to the negotiations, and the bad feelings were towards them change as they go. It's great actors. I can't remember the actors' even name. I'm hopeless. But it is a really good movie to watch as acting. I'm not sure how true it was, but it showed how Ian Paisley came around to McGuinness. It showed us becoming friends. It showed them seeing each other as people.
Yes, it was a remarkable story.
Yeah, but it is worth the film to see, that's all. With regard to, I don't know how his son is doing. How is Paisley's son doing? Is he still...
Yeah, he's still involved in politics in Northern Ireland. Yeah. He sure is. I see a hand. Well, maybe I'll just go to this person at the back first and then to you. Yeah. Hi.
I suppose I should not be saying one word, however, after 70 years, having been born in Ireland, coming over as an immigrant family, I had the privilege of going back and forth and back and forth. And I have seen such amazing changes. I knew in the 50s and 60s that we were Protestant in the south of Ireland, but I heard all the whisperings. I heard it all. I didn't see it, but there was strife. I knew it. My cousins were in the north. But when Ireland came together with the peace treaty, it was the most beautiful act. And I remember going into one of the museums and a lady said to me, in the early days, she said, every single person and child was on Valium. They were petrified to go out into the streets. I went back in 2016 for the celebration, and I went back with my close Catholic friends, and we were Protestant, and we laughed all the way through, and it was a beautiful celebration. It was the first time that the Northern Ireland Children's Choir had come down to the Republican Ireland of Ireland and sung together. It was magnificent. And for me, to hear all this rotten talk about hard line and starting all over again, it's just horrible. And I just hope and pray that we can have a soft, I don't understand nothing in politics. I know Britain has always been a problem in the EU, so why can't Britain just leave and get out? But why involve? And I know the North has always depended on Britain with good reason. All of their economics, their income, their jobs, their medical care, they were much better off in the South. But there must be a solution, because we cannot go back to what it was.
Yeah, No, absolutely, and that's what, yeah, people are really working very hard on
my
that.
emotions out. My husband will murder me, but thank you.
And could you tell us something about how you got into the political scene?
Yeah.
Besides went through journalism, but when you were in school, what first got you interested?
Okay, well, I'm not a politician, is the first thing to say. No, I'm a civil servant. So I'm a diplomat, I'm a member of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So I came into that, I was recruited as the press advisor for Irish Aid, our overseas aid programme. So that's part of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And then from that, I guess I came to the broader Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And then, you know, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is the body that sends diplomats out all over the world. So Irish diplomats all over the world are members of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and they rotate in and out of headquarters in Dublin every 3 to 4 years. So yeah, so that's how I came to be what I do.
Can I just tell you this, I don't know your name.
Oh, Judy.
Judy got the name of the movie. It is really worth saying for everybody, and it was going to bug me. It's called The Journey, and Timothy Steele plays, the great English actor plays Ian Paisley, and Colin Meaney plays McGuinness. It's just as acting, it's just fantastic.
The Journey.
And it's revealing too. Thank you.
You're right. It was a great movie.
Yeah.
It was a great story.
You see sides of Paisley that, I mean, I grew up in Cork, you know, we just thought he was a lunatic. And then in many ways, Paisley, as I can say things that you can't say, perhaps, but Paisley was seen as actually a good thing for the Russian fame and because he was such a great man. But at the same time, in his own community, he was beloved. He got a lot of things done for the unionist background people, but he was, many people thought in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, and in even some of the Catholics in Northern Ireland, thought it was Paisley was good to show them how bad they were. That's, excuse me. But this thing just didn't go to.
The Journey. Okay. No, that's a great recommendation. I haven't seen it, so I look forward to watching that. Hiya.
Hi. I don't really have a question, but I wanted to say something.
Of course.
So I lived in Northern Ireland for a year, 2000 and 2001, and I loved it so much, and it was just a wonderful, safe feeling place to be. So that was only a couple of years after the Good Friday Agreement. But any of you who are planning on going to Ireland, I would highly urge you to visit the north as well, because it's such a beautiful countryside, as is the Republic of Ireland, but you know, many beautiful things along the coast, and the people were so friendly, and not many Americans visited Northern Ireland at that time, so it was almost like people were really excited that you went there, and like, thank you for coming and visiting and not being like afraid because of everything you've heard on the radio about the troubles. Like, so anyway, I visited again about 3 years ago to visit some friends, and it was still wonderful, and I always felt very safe there. Like, if the only thing you've ever heard about Northern Ireland is things on the news about bombings and shootings and the troubles, like, it might seem scary to go there, but I always felt perfectly safe. There were, of course, some things I saw that weren't the best now and then, but I mean, same here in Vermont, right? There's scary things on the news about murders and rapes and child abuse and things like that. So, yeah, I guess I just want to say that, like, we've been talking about the worst part of Northern Ireland's history, but there's so many good things too, so give it a chance.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. It's a really good point. I mean, I think Northern Ireland's been doing really, really, really well economically and socially, and everything has been a great change there, and certainly it's well worth visiting. Anybody else like to say anything? It doesn't have to be a question. I'd like to hear from you as well.
I actually have a question. Wondering your thoughts on the impact of Brexit on the Irish film and television industry. Because I know just the threat of Brexit alone has already affected the Irish film industry. And I'm also thinking ahead as far as television, if RTE would take over Northern Ireland, and if BBC Northern Ireland would become defunct, or just if you have any other thoughts just on the Irish film and television industry after Brexit.
Yeah. I'll be honest with you, I don't know how it will be affected. I haven't read or seen or heard anything about that. I know there is a really thriving film industry, but I guess a lot of the films and things that are produced are probably produced for international audiences. And obviously they're not so much goods or services, so the issue of being traded across borders probably wouldn't be as crucial in those areas. So I can't think of anything offhand. I mean, I couldn't see RTE taking over BBC Northern Ireland because, you know, Northern Ireland will still be part of the UK, and RTE is, you know, very firmly Radio Television Éireann, which is Irish for Ireland's radio and television network, I guess. So they're very firmly based in covering the Republic of Ireland. So sorry, I don't know more about that, but I just
heard that some films have actually been halted until they felt that we're ready when Brexit has been halted until Brexit is resolved, and it's already impacted some things. I just wonder if there's any prognosis around that.
Yeah, sorry. Sounds like you know more about it than I do.
Where do you come from yourself?
From Cork.
Are you from Cork?
I am. That's what I was saying to you earlier. Yeah.
You said I was from Cork.
Cork.
So I didn't
Yeah. From Ballincollig.
Oh, for God's sake.
Yeah. See how small Ireland is?
We're probably related. I didn't realize that.
What?
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I'm from Ballincollig. I mean,
your family and stuff, are they all still there, apart from your husband?
no, my parents still live there, but most of my brothers and sisters, I'm the youngest of 6. 2 of them live in Cork, but not in Ballincollig, and the others are between Dublin and France. So, and I'm over here, obviously, but my folks are still there. So when I go home to see my parents, that's where I go. Yeah.
I have a question that I thought was maybe controversial, but since you said no one ever it was unthinkable to think that Britain would try to leave the EU, has this resurrected talk of a reunited Republic, reunited Ireland?
Yeah.
Together?
No, I mean, look, that's a really good question and a very legitimate question. So there have been calls for a united Ireland as a result of it, because I suppose, you know, the rationale being, well, you know, it would be a way for Northern Ireland to stay in the EU, but the first thing to say is the Good Friday Agreement does allow for a united Ireland, but under very specific circumstances. So those circumstances are that if, in the belief of the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland, there's a majority in Northern Ireland who would vote to be part of a united Ireland, that they would hold a border poll. And if that border poll were to return a result that said, yes, a majority do want a united Ireland, both the British and Irish governments would honour that decision. But there's no reason at the moment to believe that a majority in Northern Ireland would indeed vote for a united Ireland. And the Irish government has been very clear that that's not, you know, we're not calling for that at the moment. We don't actually believe that it is the right time for a border poll, because obviously it's a fragile enough time in Northern Ireland without introducing something that would be potentially, you know, very divisive again. So yeah, there have been talk about it and calls for it from some sides, but I don't think there's no immediate move, or, you know, even I think short to medium term move towards that happening.
So the majority voting against Brexit of Northern Ireland voting against Brexit was more of a, let's keep things status quo so we can have freedom of movement, but we still
stay within the EU. Exactly, yeah, stay within the EU. It wasn't a vote on a united Ireland. It was very much on the EU piece. Yeah.
The percentage of Catholics now in Northern Ireland, it used to be much less than it was in the 1960s. Is there more? At what point are they good? Is there something where a population burden in the Catholic world and the Protestants becoming the Protestant world having less of a vote, having less of a population? I don't understand.
I don't know what the current figures are exactly, but certainly, you know, it doesn't seem, there's nothing to suggest at the moment that a majority would vote in favour, which to me suggests that there still does remain a loyalist majority, or a unionist majority within Northern Ireland.
It's also a fact, though, that isn't it? I don't really know. This is what we were told anyway. that it would be even some of the people who wanted a kind of United Ireland in one way economically don't want the United Ireland because the social benefits, money and support to all would be better from
Northern, from the UK, is it? I've heard that as well, that, obviously, kind of anecdotally, that people would say, oh, but sure, the NHS is much better, the national health system, the UK national health system is much better, but yeah. Yeah, sorry, no, you do hear those stories anecdotally, but I don't have anything to back it up, yeah.
But it would make a reason for some Catholics in Northern Ireland wanting to stay part, or even some Protestants in Northern Ireland, even though they might want United Ireland to stay part of it.
I think you're getting signals, Ruth, are you?
I am, which is great.
Shut up.
I just want to thank, let's help me thank.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks very much.
I think the hallmark of a great speaker is that you have questions that you didn't even know to question after hearing you. Like my mind is just like,
Well, thank you very much, Ruth, and all of the team at the Burlington Heritage Festival for inviting me, Irish Heritage Festival, and thank you all very much for coming again. I really enjoyed it, so thank you.
oh, and we have a Vermont present.
Oh, lovely. Oh, thank you. And beautifully decorated. Thank you very much. That's lovely.
Okay.